Good.
Good, good. So, is it a good time for you? If all right. Well, let me make sure we're recording, and want to avoid the audio disaster we had last time. So, yes, looks like we're good. So, well, everybody, here we have Eleanor Goldfield of Act Out and numerous other enterprises directed toward the social good. So, and I thought maybe today we talk, at least as an opening, about the question of class. Though we can, you had noted an important distinction, which deserves to be fleshed out, and that's the distinction between class and hierarchy. And often those are conflated, or at least the relationship is understood in a muddled way. So maybe we could move to that latter point with some celerity or quickness. But to begin, I mean, how would you define class, Eleanor?
Well, just like with a lot of things, class is dependent upon where you find yourself, not just geographically, but historically as well. Class is it's a tool of hierarchy, and there's that distinction. Hierarchy is just an arbitrary system of deciding who is above who, and class is a way of doing that. Gender is another way, skin color. But class is a way of distinguishing people based on some arbitrary factor, whether that be your economic status or your heritage. Typically, those are the two that you see most frequently, even in a place like the U.S. that isn't supposed to have like a landed gentry that passes down wealth. We definitely have an aristocracy. Really, we have a plutocracy or an oligarchy ruled by the wealthy, a small portion of the wealthy. So class is just an arbitrary system of hierarchy that's based on economics and or heritage or religion or what have you, which you also see in this country with the fact that white Christian men are typically the highest class of people, and you can see this represented even in places like Congress. It should be a representation of the people, but of course it's not. It's overwhelmingly white Christian men who are the power structure and therefore are the highest class in this country.
Yeah, it's interesting that you stress the notion of the arbitrary. Now, I mean, I have always been inclined to see class as most fundamentally defined, and this is sort of the influence of the Marxian tradition, right, in economic terms. That the structure of the economy creates the basis whereupon you have that class defined. So, classically, that's seen in terms of one's relationship with the means of production, and if you own them, then you are bourgeois. And if not, then you're proletariat. And that's nice and neat, right? It creates a nice little dichotomy, which can be useful rhetorically, but which can also cloud the matter, because you can sort of become detained by that Manichaean purity, like in the first film of the Matrix, right? Everything's very, very clean. There's good, there's evil, and all that. But the reality is a more complicated affair. So you have these other vectors, as you noted, heritage, race. In this country is of a special moment, and so forth.
And I think it's also important to note that even in this is, I guess this is sort of veering off into hierarchy as well, but even in instances such as, Plato's The Republic, which that sort of idea was also stolen in 1984 by Orwell. But this idea that, okay, well, let's say that we just did away with class and people were just judged on, in the Republic, it's, you have a gold soul or a silver soul or an iron soul. And then in 1984, it was that, well, the party system isn't, you don't automatically get into the party system because your parents are. You take this exam or what have you, and that decides whether you get into the party. And of course, Orwell meant it as sort of this authoritarian absurdity. And of course, Plato meant it as, isn't this great? No one will be forced into a certain class or even caste based on their parents, but instead their souls. But yet, this is just another indicator of how you will fit into the class system, into a sort of hierarchy that isn't based on necessarily who you're born to, but how some authority figure deems your IQ or your soul. Again, these sort of arbitrary deciding factors that decide your fate ultimately, that you have. And I think the important thing to stress as well is that you have no control over. I think a lot of people, particularly in this country, they'll concede that you can't decide your gender or your race, but that you can choose your religion, or that you can choose even more so your economic status. But that's very incorrect. There's a very, very minuscule portion of people that will ever make it out of poverty, and yet the guise of capitalism suggests that if you just try hard enough, then you will. And you have the exceptions to the rule, like like the Ben Carsons or whatever, who grew up on welfare, saying that you just have to try hard and poverty is a state of mind. But the exceptions to the rule do not prove the antithesis of the rule. The rule still is that poverty is extremely difficult to get out of, and it will continue to get harder. And so class is not only sort of an arbitrary form of hierarchy, it's one that you can't choose to get out of.
Right.
Even if it's something like economics or religion.
Yeah, I think it's really crucial to stress the distinction between choice and illusory or false choice. And that's really the fulcrum of this meritocracy, that meritocratic story that you're referencing there. And you can just think of the whole notion, well, you've got standardized testing, but it begs the question as to what are the criteria being imposed against which these people are being tested? Who determines that? And what is driving their selection of that criteria? And it's the preordination of a certain set of social relations, which turns into the question of what does it take to progress, from a position of poverty or near poverty to privilege. And it's often said, oh, it's just a matter of hard work. But it's not just an issue of hard work. Like the saying goes, if all it took to be a millionaire was to work hard, then every woman in Africa would be a millionaire. Okay, so it's also being willing to relate with other human beings in a particular way. And so and it's also being willing to sacrifice certain aspects of one's own life. So yeah, you know what, if I work 2 jobs at 60, 70 hours a week, all of a sudden, maybe I can pay my rent and pay for my car and food and still have enough to go out on the weekend, but I don't have a life. My life is consumed by participation in toil and drudgery before someone else's whim, or if I quote, so there's an occlusion of how the terms which determine whether or not you can advance from one class to another also involves making certain choices which inexorably have a moral quality to them, whether it be with respect to oneself and how you want to constellate your own life, or how you choose to relate with other people. Like, I don't want to be
even if you do make those choices, I think that's the point, though, that it's not really about choice, because there are so many people that I've worked with on an activist level, or people that I've worked for on an activist level, and I don't mean for money. I mean, like, I've tried to push their stories, are people that do work incredibly hard and make choices to try and pull themselves into another class, even if that is just the upper echelons of the lower class, but they never make it. And I think that is the point, is that even if you make those choices, I'm not going to have kids because it's a distraction and it's a money suck. I'm going to work 3 jobs. so that I can make enough and pay off student debt, or I'm not going to go to school so that I don't have student debt. Even if you make these choices that, by the way, you shouldn't have to make in a society that has the ability to give everyone everything that they need to survive and indeed thrive. But even if you make those choices, you are still, for lack of a better word, fucked, and you will still probably live and die in the same class that you were born into. Because capitalism has no interest in having the lower classes rise up. This is not part of the plan. Capitalism, particularly capitalism as we see now, late stage capitalism, is only interested in consolidating the wealth to a smaller and smaller number of people, thereby oppressing a larger number of people and extracting as much as they can on a continual basis until literally there is nothing to extract, and it will literally just implode upon itself. But even if you were to try and make those choices, you'll probably have about as much luck as somebody saying, well, if you just all converted to Christianity and became a little whiter, you'd be okay. But that choice is just as absurd as saying to somebody, well, why don't you just work yourself out of poverty? Because in this system, it is damn near impossible to do so, even if you made all these incredibly difficult choices that you shouldn't have to make in the first place.
So, let me ask you this, because I think we're pretty much on the same page. But I think that the counterpoint would be like, well, why is that, right? Why is it that even if you work hard, you're not going to get anywhere?
Well, I think that is the structure of capitalism, right? Capitalism is a system. It's an economic system. It starts out as that. But the thing with capitalism is because it's based on an economy being centered around private enterprise, it's impossible that capitalism can exist without government collusion. So capitalism starts as an economic system, but it really is a government system as well. So that's why even countries like Sweden, for example, that are socialist, because they are a part of a capitalist system, they partake in this system of extraction and oppression. They have a much better social standing in terms of taking care of their people, but their economy is still based on extraction and oppression. Their stock market still goes up when ours goes up, and ours goes up when bad shit happens around the world, when people get bombed. So I think that capitalism at its core is something that cannot exist in line with a healthy humanity or a healthy planet, because it requires that there be people to use, whether that be in terms of direct manual labor or in terms of just servitude to the state. But it also requires that the land be used in an unsustainable manner, because the idea is that you have to always be extracting more and making more of these of this made up resource, which is money. And so capitalism is based on the idea that things that are scarce are treated as not scarce, for example, trees or water or air, and the things that are not scarce at all are treated with scarcity, like housing. Every homeless person in the U.S. could technically have 6 homes because of the amount of empty homes in this country. Education. It's not like we have a lack of education. It's like building a house and saying that you have too few inches. It doesn't make any sense. So capitalism as a system is what disallows a shift from one class system to the other. And you're even seeing that people who were upper middle class, for instance, people that were making 6 figures a year are even being kicked down on that ladder. So it's not just that the poor are getting poorer. Everybody except for those that are the ones consolidating that wealth. The 8 richest people in the world own as much as the bottom 50%. This is what capitalism is structured upon. It requires oppression and it requires extraction. You're not really going to be seeing people shifting out of their class at the bottom until people start to wake up to shifting away from capitalism.
So there's 2 points. One is sort of this relates to what you're saying about Sweden and how it has a socialist quality to it, or other, there are other countries like that. And to a degree, there are even within the U.S., you could say that there are people who, despite being not in the best of circumstances, benefit from the limited concessions which were made to a socialist vision in the mid 20th century, Social Security and what have you. Despite the fact that you can attenuate the inequities which flow forth from the market through certain government interventions, at the end of the day, there's still a deep injustice which cannot be removed because of that requirement of some sort of extractive logic. So to try and flesh it out, like take Sweden for example, Sweden is able to provide things like free education and healthcare because they have a certain level of tax revenue flowing to them from their population. From where did those people derive the income to get that tax, right? And I'm not personally that familiar with the constitution of the Swedish economy, but I can be relatively confident that that's where the sausage is made. And you look at what are the terms of exploitation which allow the Swedish government or other socialist governments to provide their people with a certain standard of living, and oftentimes it's going to go and point to industries which are outside of Sweden. I don't know, I'm guessing that's the case, but I mean that's certainly the case in like here in the U.S. where you have reliance on cheap labor in Asia and other parts of the world.
Well, yeah, I think that it's important to note that like while you can do good things under capitalism, that you have things like B Corps, like Patagonia, for example. It's more of again, it's the exception to the rule, and it's almost that this happens despite the best efforts of capitalism, right? Because capitalism again is structured on oppression and extraction. So if you have there are several Swedish companies that do really great work, whether that be the fact that they are recycling to the extent that Sweden is actually importing trash because we're doing such a good job of shifting towards greener energy sources. It's not that you can't do good things under capitalism, it's that capitalism is not built to do good things. So if you are able to do good things under capitalism, it's because you found a loophole or you've found a way to use the system against itself. And then of course the question is, well, why don't we just do that and then we can have capitalism? Because that's not really capitalism. And in fact, then it actually makes it's kind of like the Democratic Party. It's easier to just form a new party than try to reform a broken party. Instead of trying to make capitalism into something it's not, instead of trying to make capitalism something that works for people and the planet, it is much easier to shift towards something that is not built on that. And again, with Sweden, this idea of private enterprise, Sweden also does a much better job of the US than the US of regulating. And the reason that you need regulation is because capitalism has to be regulated because it has no interest in these the problem of scarce resources, the problem of human lives, the problem of planetary sustainability. That's why you have to have regulation. And so capitalism in and of itself is a system that is easier left than trying to reform it and really trying to wrestle with it, particularly when it comes to the issue of class and hierarchical systems.
Now, before we transition more, this has all sort of been what we're talking about implicitly anyway, is hierarchy, but so far we've sort of inflected class as it manifests economically. And let me ask you, because I don't know as much about this as I should, but and it's sort of a parallel, a distinct manifestation, is around the question of gender, right, and how this plays into it. So you have patriarchal frameworks, which have been mitigated in their effect somewhat over the past 2 centuries, but they still have overwhelming power and are tied into capitalist currents. Why don't I just ask you in a rather open way to sort of reflect on that, gender as a class issue, and it's.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think again, historically, gender has been a tremendous issue in terms of the class system, because women were they could be thrown into the same classes as men, but inside of each class you had sort of like a subclass. So there were, of course, aristocratic women, but could they sit at the table when politics were being discussed? Could they offer up their ideas when it came to scientific endeavors or mathematic endeavors? I was just reading a book about Marie Châtelet, who was a French woman who lived right after Isaac Newton, and she basically, she was an aristocratic woman, and she was considered quite the Renaissance woman, because not only did she walk around in her summer home without a corset, but she had she was a tremendously brilliant mathematician and scientist, which was so unusual in that day, not because women are idiots, but because they weren't given that form of training. They were allowed to be taught in terms of the classics and philosophy. But when it came to, at that point, because math and science were very hardcore issues at the time, they weren't given those skills. They were given like rudimentary algebra skills, like x plus 1 equals 5 or something. But beyond that, she had to use her status and her network to battle consistently to get more information and more education on the subjects of math and science. And I mean, you still see this, not in the US, but you still see this around the world, whether that be child brides or women and girls being locked out of education and indeed politics. So this idea of the class structure based on gender is really something that you don't see it necessarily so overtly, like, oh, well, you're a lower class because you're a woman, because women still fit into the classes that men do, but in those distinct classes, they are still a subset of the man in that class. And of course, the same thing goes for somebody who's black, for instance. So in the U.S., you have poor white people, but then you have poor black people, and it's very obvious who is higher on the U.S. class structure, if that's a white person or a black person, even if they're in the same economic status. So there are subclasses to each class, and I think that's also important to note, that again, even if you just say that class is based on economics, even inside of those classes, you have subclasses. And I think it's even more obvious when you look at, for example, how many black billionaires are there compared to white ones. And also, I think that I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Margaret Kimberley, who's a writer for the Black Agenda Report. This is the other problem with capitalism, and it's that the state, so to speak, is a state of mind. And what that means is that people were so excited that Obama was going to be the first black president, but Margaret's point was, well, considering what a black man has to do to become president and basically separate himself from the black struggle in this country, do we want that? Which is the same thing that I say when somebody was like, isn't it great that there's a female CEO of Lockheed Martin? Yeah, great. Now a woman can bomb the shit out of people and be proud of it just like a man could before. Why should I be proud of that? And so that's the other thing that the state does in terms of pitting us against each other in this drive to get to another class, to better our identifying group, whether that be women or blacks or Muslims or Hispanics. Oh, let me get to the white man's circle,
Right.
And then I can be proud of bombing people and oppressing people, and I can be a good capitalist too.
Right.
And it's this sick, twisted form of brainwashing and keeping us not only oppressed, but keeping us enslaved mentally and enslaved economically, even if we get to the higher circles that were once only reserved for white men.
Mm-hmm. In fact, yes, you're being colonized by the values of the oppressor, is what, to use the sort of, that's what's going on, is that you find yourself in a situation where you're downtrodden, and the contrast is manifested in these people who have, this money, this power. So you want to embrace whatever framework it is within which they are working, but to do that, you have to reject solidarity with those who are also in a dejected state. And this is, like you said, it's insidious, and it's sort of how it operates. And Hillary Clinton, ooh, woman for president. If you look at Hillary Clinton's life, it's actually kind of sad. It's actually kind of depressing. Here's a person who has, through the course of her life, as far as I can tell, has made compromise after compromise with respect to her own dignity to serve these really awful people, or institutions. And it's, you got to step outside of the system.
And that's why it's so difficult, because the class system is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is really that people are raised to think that patriarchy, that hierarchy as a whole, is good. It's that it's merciful. I mean, James Baldwin talked about how the most brilliant thing that the white supremacists ever did was to teach black people to hate themselves. And that's true if you're always trying to be something that you can never be, whether that be white or male or cisgender or ultimately even rich, then you're so preoccupied with self-loathing and trying to become really what you hate, which is the oppressing force, then you can't actually be a force for good. And you certainly don't have time to break down the extreme mental gymnastics that has put you in a place to be fighting against your own self-interest, the own interests of your fellow human beings and the planet, in order to tear down this class and hierarchical structure. So it's really, I mean, it is a brilliant construct, because we have to play the game in order for the game to work, but we also have to play the game to a certain extent in order to survive. Because surviving outside the confines of the system, I mean, unless you have like a plot of land and know how to grow your own vegetables, it's really difficult for somebody to just exist outside the confines of the system. And even if you can Robinson Crusoe it somewhere, the question is, should you? Because should you stay and should you fight for, justice and the rights of your fellow human beings, and thereby again still have to play the game to a certain extent? I mean, I still make dollars and cents for what I do, which means that I'm still part of this ridiculous rat race, yet my job is to try and continuously reject the rat race, and and extract my own mind from the rat race. And it really is, it's incredibly difficult. And it is, it's something that's so entrenched that, for the most part, even if you recognize things like patriarchy or racism, to say that the whole system of hierarchy and indeed class, is not something that you prescribe to any longer is incredibly difficult, because I think no matter who you are, no matter how woke you are, there's a part of you that wants more money. There's a part of you that wants to be more comfortable. There's a part of you that wants to get ahead, and that's because that's how you've been raised, from being a baby. Even if you were raised by very left parents, the fact that you see 3,000 ads a day, the fact that you went to school with other people and that person might have had more than you or a newer shirt or what have you. I mean, there's a lot of insidious things that happen subconsciously that tie you to the class system that exists.
It's disingenuous to pretend that you're not complicit. And if you go ahead and this it's rather individual, right? Because you can do the, as you said, the Robinson Crusoe thing, but that really is sort of depending on, like, if I were to try and do something like that, I feel like I would just be indulging in escapism. For other people, it would be appropriate. That's sort of a more subjectively determined course. But I wanted to bring up, this is because one other question here, and that's about how these things manifest on a familial basis, right? Which is something which I think is really insidious, especially with respect to gender, how it's within a family that, and it's not in the West as bad as it once was, but this primacy of the masculine over the feminine, or the male over the female, can manifest in certain labor distribution, and this is actually ties into what we're just talking about here, about how it's so hard to get outside the logic of the system, right? You're like, well, women do all this unpaid domestic work, and then some people think, well, we should go ahead and start paying them, which at one level is fair, but then the counterpoint is that as soon as you start commodifying the work in the home, then what you've done is you've economized the home itself, and the basis of what should be relationships which transcend fiscal terms are then subordinated to those fiscal terms. And all that's going on. At the same time, you still have this conditioning whereby the distribution of labor tends to dramatically favor the man, or at least it has historically, right? And you gotta separate that term off as well. So, it's such a mess. It's a tangle.
It's the question, the comical question, like, well, how much would you charge to help your grandmother with her groceries up the stairs? Like, of course you wouldn't charge anything, because that's what being a good person is. And of course that argument could be used other places, like, okay, well, let's say that you're a school bus driver. Well, it's just being a good person to drive kids to school, right? Why do you need to get paid for that? Like,
right.
Ultimately, of course, a lot of people think that having any sort of money-based system economy is bad, because it does bring out the worst in people. And I tend to agree. I mean, they've done scientific studies where if you ask people to do something for free, they're more likely to do it. And if you even say, actually, there was a study that was conducted in Switzerland where they asked people if they were willing to have a nuclear power plant in their neighborhood. And this was back when nuclear energy was considered to be, like, very clean and green. And they said, most of the neighbors said, yeah, well, of course, because that'll be good for us. It'll be good to have energy close by. Then they asked the same question, but said that they would offer them, $5,000. The amount of people that said yes diminished significantly, because there was a feeling that, oh, well, if you're going to pay me for it, then that must mean that there's something bad about it. And now I don't really feel like that'll be good for me. And so there is this, when you add capital to any situation, in that case, you have people saying, I don't want any part of it because now it seems like there's something bad. And then you have other research that shows when you add capital to a situation, people become more selfish. Like, oh, well, I'd be willing to help you as long as you pay me for it. So it's the problem of adding money to a situation and what that does to our ultimately pretty simplistic animal brains. And in terms of gender, I mean, really, if you look back historically, back to the beginnings of hunter-gatherers, it was basically just based on biology. I mean, even the most staunch feminists can't argue the fact that men are better suited to carry heavy shit and are typically faster runners, and so they were just better suited to hunt. And women particularly, because we are, our bodies are directly responsible for keeping babies alive. we were better suited to care for the children, particularly because if you try stalking an animal and a baby starts crying, well, there goes dinner. So it was basic biology that created the division of labor. And it wasn't until we progressed into a system of hierarchy that that became problematic. Of course, then you had, men starting to war over property, which included women at times. Um, and so that was what really became a problem. But the basic idea of a division of labor at this point in time is basically it should be based on choice. If a woman feels that she wants to bear children and be at home, that's fine. Who am I to say, particularly as a feminist, that she shouldn't be allowed to do that? The problem, of course, comes with capitalism, and that's why a lot of people believe in a universal basic income. That regardless of who you are or what you're doing, you get a certain amount of money from the government, and so that you can choose to do what you want based on whatever factors dictate your passions in life. Of course, the problem with that is that you're asking the same oppressive state to help you out monetarily. And so that's why I look at things like universal basic income as a stopgap solution. It's not going to fix the problem of capitalism. It's not going to save us. But it is a stopgap solution that will ultimately pull people out of poverty and save millions of lives, because people do die of poverty. And in terms of the familial issue of gender issues, I really think that, like with anything else, I think education is really the answer to that. And I don't just mean educating men, I mean educating women too. There have been several studies that show that one of the defining factors of pulling certain communities out of poverty, particularly in the third world, is educating girls. Because girls are these women, once they are educated, most of the time they will bring back that knowledge and those expertise to their village, whereas men have a much more higher tendency to take that outward, out to the world. But women have much more strong ties to where they're from in those terms. So you have these newly educated women going back to their villages, and with that new knowledge, coming up with ways to better where they're from and better not only their situation, but the situation for their entire community. So I do think, and of course that's the problem with this country, is that we're on a anti-intellectual path that keeps going downhill at never increasing speed. It is incredibly important that we educate people, and that in particular now I think it's very important that we focus education as well. I'm speaking as a white person, but I think that in our communities, because of the rise of white vigilante violence, which is coupled with extreme patriarchy. So racism and patriarchy go hand in hand. So the rise of white supremacy is very much the rise of anti-woman, anti-LGBTQIA, and anti-black and brown. And so we have a lot of work to do in our communities as white people to really pinpoint these behaviors and extract them and kill them before they become the next wave of anti-woman, anti-black, anti-gay fervor. And to be sure, just as a black person can be anti-black, a woman can also be anti-woman. And I think it's very important that we focus on education, because that is not only the way that we extract ourselves from a patriarchal system, but also a system that is so pinpointed on class and capitalism.
Yeah. I just want to, I think it's important to add to that focus that you get really clear about what you mean by education. Because it's not just an issue of transmitting new agricultural techniques or interesting historical facts or what have you. It's about enlivening in the student realization of their own capacity to engage the world in a creative and meaningful fashion. And in a sense, the curriculum, the content of the curriculum, is just something upon which the catalyzation of that insight is is carried or piggybacked, right? Not that obviously content matters, but it's really crucial that the student is empowered in the process.
And taught not what to think, but how to think. It's incredibly important because you mentioned standardized testing. That is a way of creating these proles, these drones that do as they're told and know a set amount of information that they're supposed to know, and also it creates an expiration date for learning. A lot of times in this country we're like, okay, well, as soon as I'm done with college, I'm out into the workforce, and then I'm done, and then sort of this, okay, well, then I stop learning. Well, then your brain dies. If you're not constantly renewing and questioning the information that you've taken in, your brain atrophies. You have to use it as if it's a muscle. And in this country, I think outside of the obesity problem in terms of our bodies, there's an obese mind problem because we do not use our brains in an abstract or critical way at all. We put a lot of accolades on just being able to do menial tasks that honestly, robots should, and will be doing very soon. And we put no emphasis on the creative mind. And that's why when you look at schools, the first things to be cut are art classes, music classes that really teach you to think outside of the box. Because creative people are a lot more difficult to control. They start questioning things. And so with the idea of getting kids to really instilling in them a passion for learning, it's also a matter of instilling in them a passion for thinking and not just what to think, but how to think. And I think also like that idea of seeing themselves in the story. Huey P. Newton talked about in his autobiography that he never learned one thing that was important to his life experience in school. And indeed, he graduated from high school illiterate and then went on to teach himself how to read by reading Plato, which I don't even know how you do that, but I think that's a really important thing too, is that we focus so much on it is a very propagandized system of learning, and not only do we lose so much of our own story as Americans, but we force out people that are Americans. For example, if you read the average history textbook, the Native Americans are just like in the Trail of Tears and oops, I'm sorry, we gave you smallpox blankets. Now on to the next chapter. And there's no way for a proud Native American child or a proud black child to see themselves in a positive light in our history as Americans, or you're relegated to Black history classes, which are only available once you get to college. So we're raising children to think of the world as this Eurocentric, white, male-dominated structure that you have to learn how to survive in, or else you'll just end up a useless prole on the sidewalk, probably homeless. And this is what we're teaching to kids. And so it's no wonder that A, they have no passion for learning, and B, that they don't know how to think abstractly with these standardized testings, and sort of like multiple choice style, like check the box kind of questionnaires, as opposed to let's really dig into this and let's talk about the analysis of something, as opposed to just throwing facts at your face.
So there's some interesting ambiguities in this realm, right? Because you have the issue of public schools as the primary vehicle for the transmission of education, but it is largely within public schools that these retrograde approaches to pedagogy are assumed. And there's this. So what is the way out, right? You've got homeschooling as one strategy, but then this creates these silo vicinities. So some homeschooling communities are incredibly radical and progressive, but then there are others which are absolutely terrifying in the worldviews that they are inculcating. And then you have the intermediary, the seemingly intermediary set of charter schools, but then the charter schools are not entirely, but the vast majority of charter schools are really just ways in for the system of privatization, a la, and that's what someone like Betsy DeVos is about, right? So to bring it back to the question of the left, and how is the left going to respond to this circumstance? What do you think one should do?
I mean, I think you have to be very cognizant of the build aspect and the fight and build strategy. Because like I say, an opposition or resistance is not a movement. It's a negation of the status quo. And while that's incredibly important, of course, it's not an alternative. And you have to build an alternative. Going back to Newton and the Black Panthers, if something is missing from the system, you have to build it. Like the school, like the breakfasts, that the Black Panthers provided. Well, that was something that was missing. These kids were outcasts. They were not important to the system. Outside of course, being the typical black labor force that the white supremacist system wanted to use. But it is, I mean, it sucks to say it this way, but you have to build it. And you see this a lot of places. People that I've had the fortune to speak to and to interview on my show, people are building community centers. Here in DC, we're trying to maintain this art space that's left over from the People's Climate March that was here, to create these spaces where people, not just kids, because again, learning is not something that's just specific to children, to create a community space where we can not only come to create and be creative, but to also come and interact with each other and learn and question. And feel a little uncomfortable, feel like, wow, I'm the only white person here. That's interesting. And have those feelings of, okay, well then why are the people that are, my friend said to me, was like, well, why are all the people that don't have access to a community center not white? And I was like, well, let's go have a drink and we'll talk about it. But these questions are ones that need to be asked, and ones that have very, very specific and historical answers. And the way that you get to those is by building these spaces, by building the alternatives that the system won't give you, because they have no interest in you questioning. They have no interest in you learning. And who better to learn it from than the people that are living it? And so I think it's very important that we intersectionally, gender, race, religion, what have you, we intersectionally come and build these spaces, whether that be a community center, a community garden, an after-school program, which, I mean, by after-school program, it could be as simple as like a hangout at a teacher's house or a neighbor's house where you sit and you teach the kids some Black history that they didn't learn, or you teach girls everything from self-defense to the history of feminism. You teach people what they've missed from the systemic outline of how a good citizen, how a good prole should be. And again, that sounds like kind of a bummer, because it's a lot more work than just petitioning your Congress member, but it's necessary. And that is, to bring it back full circle, that's also the only way that you extract yourself from the class and capitalism system, is by building an alternative, because building an alternative is the only thing that can ultimately battle the fall, because once capitalism falls, and it will fall, the tendency, if we don't have anything in place, will be to try from the ashes to build something that is like what we just
Right.
watched burn, because that's the human tendency, is to try and feel comfortable, particularly in extreme times of desperation, which will be after the fall of capitalism. And if you don't have anything in place, if you don't have these communities that are built on solidarity and flat structure and food sovereignty and gender equality, then you are going to ultimately build something back up again that is possibly a shittier version of what just burnt to the ground.
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely the key is that it's ultimately committing to a creative and not simply oppositional ground, right? I think it's also relevant with reference to the environmental question and the system of energy. This is a whole other thing, but it's just increasingly occurs to me that the left can't just be satisfied with resisting fossil fuels. You have to start constructing alternative systems of energy and not wait for the government to do it for us, right? Because that's at best an incredibly that's going to occur at a glacial pace at best. So, which is just a footnote to what you were saying, which is quite apt and to the point. So, I guess also, with the question of horizontality or flat level communities, right? This is nested within the problem of hierarchy is the problem of power, and maybe we'll sort of close out with this in terms of human relationship. This idea that you can't do away with the idea that there are certain people who should be invested with authority. And it really, I personally experience, at least anecdotally, a resistance to the idea that we can construct a society which rejects that as a necessity. Because I think that it requires an act of faith on the part of those such as myself who want such a world. But I think it's altogether possible. But what is your view on that issue?
I think like particularly for white people, I've found that one of the things that really hit me was when I first started reading James Baldwin. I remember his quote, and I probably won't get it perfectly right. But it's something like, it's not just about the fact that America has a Negro. The question is, why did you have to have one? Why did you need one? And that question is mind-blowing. Why the hell do we find it necessary to create an entire economy based on the extreme oppression of one type of person? And that, of course, goes back to the question of domination. Why do we find it necessary to dominate? Because it's not something that is necessary. And there are plenty of examples of flat structured systems that have worked. The problem is, of course, that with the creation of capitalism, with the creation of globalization, even if you go back, to ancient Greece, these sort of expanding armies that had hierarchical structures, that made it so that a lot of the flat structured, more peaceful entities were overrun and overtaken, and these hierarchical systems were installed. But at this point in time, I think that it's important to ask that question, not just in terms of why do we need a Negro, but why do we need a lower class? Why do we need for women to be objectified and diminished? Why do we need Muslims to be that, or whatever class, whatever group of people? And the answer, ultimately, if you follow the red thread, is that the systems that we've built require an oppressed mass. Whether that be feudalism or current day capitalism, we require somebody that can always be kicked down at. And so I think when you look at it that way, and you see that isn't good for people, and obviously it's not good for planet either, because if you look also at that trajectory of oppression, it is the black and brown people that are at the front lines of climate change, and the poor that are bearing the brunt of our dirty energy choices. So if you look at it that way, then you see that this need for domination is a manufactured need. It's just like the manufactured need for, clothes or makeup or whatever. It's like these are not actual. This is part of a consumerist capitalist facade that is not human nature. And people like to point at the fact that, oh, well, we're closely related to chimps, and chimps are very territorial. And I would tend to think that what I think is more likely is that we have projected our systems of hierarchy onto the natural world. So we'll say things like, oh, look at how the male lion dominates the female lion. No, that's not what's happening. There's a goal of survival there, and they're doing what's necessary in terms of division of labor to get shit done. We are projecting our systems of hierarchy to say that that's what's happening, but that's not what's happening. We're trying to make excuses for our way of life as we see ourselves at the top of the pyramid. When in reality, the way that we exist is that we exist in a circle, and we are dependent upon all other life forms and on each other. And those life forms are just as non-hierarchical as we are. We are interdependent, and even in a flat structure, what you'll see happen is you'll see people go to the fore, or take the stage, or what have you, or take a leading role when necessary. You know, for example, if somebody's going to lead a direct action, then the person with the most direct action training will probably lead and tell people like, hey, here are some ideas, here are the tactics I think we should use. That is not the same as power and domination. Structure is not the same as hierarchy, and that's a very important thing to note as well. Having a form of structure where you allow people to lead when necessary is very important, and it can be incredibly great and fruitful. The problem comes when that power solidifies into a dominant role that is secured by wealth or by gender or by race or religion or what have you. And those are manufactured. They might have been manufactured thousands of years ago, but they are in fact manufactured. And if you start looking back, if you start asking questions and following the thread, you'll find that human beings don't need these systems of hierarchy. They are just they are state of minds, and indeed the state exists as a state of mind. And if we can extract ourselves from that state, then we can indeed defeat the state outside as well as inside our minds.
Right on, right on. So I mean, I concur. So so I think I thought of something else, but it eludes me. But it doesn't really. It's not a moment because I think you summed it up well. So I guess maybe we can sort of. I guess what I was going to say is that it's important, I think, just to add. This is just really as a footnote, right? Where you have a situation where a person is, you know, from a rather pragmatic standpoint, being the leader because they have the happenstance of more knowledge or something like that. It creates a temptation for those in the position being led to kind of forsake their own responsibility. Like, oh, now I just get to follow orders. And there's something comforting about that. And I just exhort people to resist the temptation of that particular comfort. Because
right. And it's important to note the difference between orders and suggestions. You know, like in a flat structure system, there aren't orders. There are responsibilities, and there are suggestions. But for example, if you look at Rojava, what's happening there? Like a community council cannot order their people to do something. They can make suggestions. And here's the thing, based on the education of the people in Rojava, if they offer them a suggestion and it's backed up by evidence, like, hey, here's what we should do with our communal stores of bread or whatever, and this is why I think so, and this is based on yada, 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 and it makes sense, then there is an overwhelming response of, yes, we should do that. And that doesn't mean that it's always perfect and that people always agree. But it does mean that and of course this goes back to education. If people are taught to use reason and to accept facts and information as they are presented, then you will have something that allows for people to accept suggestion, and you won't need orders. You won't need someone to force someone into something for their own good, whatever that might mean. And it also means that if that were to happen, you can get rid of that toxic person, not like killing them or anything, but you can remove them from that momentary leadership role, because it is, of course, a momentary leadership role. And so I think that's and this, of course, plugs into the issue of language, which I guess we can talk about some other time, but the importance of using language properly and understanding how much our language is based on a system of hierarchy, and how much we use things like orders in our daily lives because we are still, that system and structure of hierarchy is still so much ingrained in our minds.
Yeah, that's a topic for another day because it opens up into so much. So we'll have to leave it there. So thank you, Eleanor, for talking with me.
Thank you so much.
And I guess we'll leave it there. So have a lovely afternoon.
You too. Thank you.
And hopefully we'll have this up in a little bit. So
okay. Thanks.
Bye-bye.